Welcome to TrustTalk. Our guest today is Martijn Lampert, co-founder and research director at Glocalities, a values-based international research and marketing insights organization that became known after their 2020 study on trust in the United Nations. Their most recent trend study, 2022, is based upon interviews of 300,000 people stretching over 20 countries and spanning a period of 8 years since the start in 2014. Gen Z is more activist and at the same time less optimistic and disenfranchised about their future. They have diminishing trust in meeting sustainability goals and their prospect to flourish as well as to make a political impact. Half of the world's population is aged below 30, but only 2.6% of the world's parliamentarians are under 30. The young generation is the highest educated generation ever in human history. They have higher levels of trust in education and science. They are the most connected generation ever through the internet and at the same time are emancipating and increasingly looking for purpose and quality of life. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Martijn, welcome at TrustTalk. As a research director of Glocalities, you regularly conduct surveys on many subjects, including trust-related subjects. Before we go into the details, especially the findings of trust by Gen Z, because that will be the core of our interview today, can you tell a bit more about the methodology and where the differences is between the surveys that you conduct and those that Edelman and Pew do?
Definitely, yes, Severin. Thank you for your invitation. It's an honor to be here and to talk about this highly important topic that is under a lot of scrutiny these days. So the difference between our methodology and the methodology of, for example, Edelman and Pew is that we relate trust or distrust to the underlying values of people. And we see that it's totally different if you trust NGOs or trust fossil fuel companies. The profiles of these people differ for a lot. And that is very meaningful information if you want to navigate these turbulent times. And that's what we focus on.
In 2020, you did a study on trust in the United Nations. Half of the world population, 47%, trust the UN and only 29% do not. A substantially higher level of trust compared to the trust that citizens have in other governmental institutions such as the EU, it's only 38%, the NATO, 35%, government, 31%, and parliament, a meager 26%. In times of urgent international crisis, on the one hand that's a relief, and on the other hand also cause for worry, because 26% trust in parliaments sounds not very high. What's your finding on this?
It's really interesting to look more deeply into the people who have trust in the United Nations. And then we see that people project a lot of hope and ideals onto the United Nations. And that's totally logical. It was established after the largest crisis of the last centuries, after World War II. Countries decided to come together and never to let that happen again. And still this whole idea and also the name United Nations, it's about a united humankind. And that is what a lot of people are longing for. So I do not ascribe these high levels of trust in the United Nations to the fact that the United Nations is delivering, but I do ascribe it to the hopes and ideals that people project into it. People who have trust in the United Nations, we find them both on the conservatives and the progressive sides of, an often polarized society. That's very interesting. So there are higher ideals that you can aspire to.
Pippa Norris, a lecturer in comparative politics at Harvard Kennedy School, in her recent book In Praise of Skepticism, says that trust in the UN comes especially from younger people, which is due to the support for cosmopolitan over nationalist values, because you were just talking about values. Is that backed up by your research?
Definitely. So we also described that in the survey on trust in the United Nations that we released in cooperation with the United Nations a few years ago at the eve of the 75th anniversary of the UN. There we see there are definitely age differences, but not huge age differences. And if we look into the profile of those younger people, and indeed the UN is more trusted amongst younger generations, they tend to feel more like a global citizen, are more open-minded, have more trust also in science and in progress. They feel like global citizens. And that is why they have such a high level of trust in the United Nations. So that is also the methodology that we use for understanding trust in a specific institution. That will be high amongst people who resonate with that institution, who have similar values to that institution.
Talking about the youth, the millennials and the Gen Z, new research from Glocalities in the international advocacy organization Global Citizen that came out before our interview shows a rise in pessimism, frustration and anxiety. Can you guide us through those findings and explain what consequences that will have in the trust young people will have in their future?
Yeah, this is a rather worrisome development. So we have been measuring values since 2014. We had in 20 countries 7 waves of fieldwork, interviewing around 300,000 people. So we can, in a quite granular fashion, detect trends. And one of the main trends is that young people globally increasingly feel alienated and let down by society, more pessimistic about the future, partly as an effect of the COVID crisis and the isolation, which has also led to mental health issues, but partly also because we live in a time of polycrisis. And climate anxieties are also on the rise, mainly amongst the young generation. Almost half of the world's Gen Z say that I think that the future holds nothing for me. And this has gone up. This has various effects. So youth increasingly feel disenfranchised. One of the main findings is that in emerging markets, where 9 out of 10 young people live, that are generally also more authoritarian and more conservative in their values, youth are increasingly emancipating. And this is to the extreme visible in a country like Iran, where young people are violently repressed by the theocratic regime. But we see it also happening in Russia. To give an example, in 2014, 66% of young adults in Russia, 18 to 24 years old, said the father should be the head of the household. It's a conservative country, a conservative statement. But this is going down because now it's at 50%. So still a conservative country. In liberal countries, this is totally a statement that is not agreed with, but this shift is on the way. We also see this happening in China, for example. So throughout the emerging markets, there is under the surface a cultural shift, a cultural revolution even happening. And we had that cultural revolution in the West in the 60s and the 70s. We now see signs of this happening there.
It looks also as a sign of activism, right? Eager to take the future into your own hands. The generation that hopefully think that they can change things, but it can also be easily flawed when we are unable to deliver on sustainability goals, like a dramatic reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, to name one of the few challenges. What is your take on that, given your trend study results that you recently published?
Well, we see that political interest is on the rise, but not necessarily to the highest level amongst the young generation. And that is interesting because also the older generation, they show a larger rise in political interest. There is a clear disconnect, and this is related very much to the trust crisis between the political system and the young generation. Half of the world population is aged below 30. Only 2.6% of the world's parliamentarians are under 30. And 9 out of 10 youth come from these emerging countries. So here you see the huge disconnect between, you could say, governmental leadership and the issues that the youth care about. And they are not being represented well. So in combination with this alienation and disenfranchisement, they are not growing up in circumstances that can make them flourish, that can make them blossom. And that's why this mental health crisis is also on the rise. Because if you are young and you want to develop and you have your dreams, but you're not facilitated by the culture, then of course, trust in politics is also low. there's a disconnect. At the same time, youth worry very much about human rights violations. That's scoring really high, and climate anxieties. And there are definitely young people stepping up. But in emerging countries, in authoritarian regimes, they are also violently repressed. And if you're an activist, you're not safe.
No, I wanted to go into what you just mentioned about the data from the Inter-Parliamentary Union, that more than half of the world's population is under the 30 years old, but only 2.6% of the members of parliament are under 30 years of age, and less than 1% of them are women. If you see those figures, it shows that young people are alienated from where power lies and rules are made. In my view, and I hope to hear your view on that, that dramatically undermines trust.
Definitely. And not only it undermines trust for the young generation, but also the older generation also wants to take care of the children of the future. So the whole idea of generations helping generations grow up is undermined by the current political system. And people are not able to flourish then. So I think this is part of the roots of the trust crisis, that we live in a societal and political system that is unable to represent the interests, but also to help develop the passions of the youth.
I wanted to go a little bit further into what you just mentioned. Another finding from the trend study that came out recently is that Gen Z strongly worried about social and environmental issues. I understand from the trend study that the top 3 concerns among citizens aged 18 to 24 globally are all related to the human rights abuses, sexual abuse and harassment, 56%, human rights violations, 49%, and child neglect, 49%, the worry about climate change, 47%, and extreme poverty, 45%. These are remarkably high percentages. Is there sufficient trust by that generation? I mean, the next generation that basically have our futures, our mankind futures in their hands. How will they be able to make changes, the necessary changes?
I think by realizing their own power as a massive generation and demanding change together. The young generation is the highest educated generation ever in human history. They have higher levels of trust in education and science than older generations. They are the most connected generation ever through the internet in human history. We see also that their values are converging, they are emancipating and increasingly looking for purpose and quality of life. But they oftentimes feel disenfranchised and do not realize their own power as a generation. So I think the only way to make change happen is that this generation becomes self-confident of its collective power and stands up for the issues that they care about. For example, a lot of old institutions have problems in getting the new workforce, workers from the young generation. But if the young generation does not want to work for you, what kind of future do you have? So that is the power that this generation has. And it's not yet organized politically because they have distrust in the political system, and the political system is not facilitating them. But I'm hopeful that there will be other ways. And youth activism is definitely on the rise. I mentioned already some examples. The Fridays for Future movement of Greta Thunberg, of course, it's spread around the world. More and more young people are standing up for their rights. Through the suffering and alienation and mental health crisis, they are also seeing and paving the way out of the crisis. And I think older generations need to respect that and follow that example, because the older generation oftentimes is also stuck themselves in old ways of thinking. So in the end, the solution will be the collaborative efforts of leaders that are now in power, who want to facilitate and be the mentor of the young generation and stimulate them to develop themselves. And you can do that in government and in NGOs, in your own company. This is the way forward with these huge crises that we are facing all together.
You mentioned the Gen Z is the most connected generation we ever had. On the other hand, we all know the threats of being connected. So how do they defend against threats coming from misinformation?
Absolutely. They are susceptible to that as well. At the same time, and that makes me hopeful, they have a lot of trust in science and are highly educated. So on average, they can make a difference between what is fake and what is real, and they also want to find out about it. One of the trends that we see in the research is that transparency of companies, also about their purpose, but also about how they produce things and all that. That is what the young generation wants more of. If you think about us being led by misinformation, then you give all the power in the hands of the ones who try to mislead us. But this young generation is much bigger and much smarter and better educated. So I have trust in their ability on a collective level to make that distinction.
Well, it's good to end with a positive note. My last question would be about your company, Glocalities. I know that you've been researching different subjects, not just trust. But if we focus on trust, what are your future research subjects on trust?
So I already mentioned the topic of human flourishing. And I think increasingly that is becoming important, and it's totally correlated with higher level of trust.
What do you mean by human flourishing?
That people are fully able to develop themselves as a person in their career, to realize their dreams and aspirations. That's highly motivating. If you are able to do that, we see that in the data, your levels of trust in lots of institutions is much higher than people who feel alienated and unable to develop themselves. They tend to have very low levels of trust. So I think there's like an underlying dimension that is strongly correlated with trust, which has to do with the ability and the circumstances that you're in or not to develop yourself to the fullest. And we are in the midst of a paradigm shift from the Homo economicus to the Homo florens. And what does that mean? We come from a neoliberal era where rationality, maximization of profit has been leading. But we're running against the borders of it with too much exploitation of nature leading to the climate crisis, too much inequalities leading to people uprising. So the new paradigm to tap into, and that connects much more with the human heart and not only with the head. And that's also connected to the world's faith traditions, for example, or to discussions about purpose or even the soul. That is related to an innate potential that you have as a person, but also as a collective or as a company that people want to contribute to. And we know that people who tend to flourish, to tend to thrive, have better connections in society, have meaningful work, they feel psychologically more in balance. So it's also related to positive psychology. So that is the route that I would trust researchers recommend to take. And that's the route that I'm taking myself as well. And that's exactly the reason why I'm looking beyond only economic figures, but also doing research into changing values and narratives and stories and life purpose even, and company purpose. Because once we have a conversation that's about these topics, people tend to be more energized than when you only talk about the numbers. We're full human beings. We live in an environment that can enable us to thrive. And that is where we have to start restoring trust, by recognizing that.
Well, Martijn, that's exactly what we try to do at the TrustTalk podcast by interviewing people like yourself who have strong views on trust and hopefully improve the insights on what drives trust or distrust and do something about it. I thank you very much for the positive note. When this podcast is published, we're nearing Christmas, always a time to reflect and also to try to be positive for the next year to come. Thank you very much for your contribution and wish you good luck with Glocalities.
Thank you, and everyone, a happy Christmas and a good new year.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Trust Talk. We would be very grateful if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Don't miss out on future travels around trust, and subscribe to this channel or visit us on our website, trusttalk.co, or on Twitter at trusttalkco. We look forward to seeing you again.